Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. We are continuing with Haunted Places of Yorkshire and we are on York. And we're starting at the Theatre Royal in York, but York is one of those places where there is a lot of history and hauntings. The Theatre Royal St Leonard's Place, York, was once the site of the St Leonard's Hospital, which was run by nuns. Not surprisingly, the ghost here is that of a young nun who is usually seen in a small room near the dress circle of the theatre. The cast and crews of the hundreds of plays staged at the Theatre Royal have had unaccountable things happen to them, and the nun, dressed in a grey and white coat, is also seen leaning over a stage box and at the front of the auditorium. The most spectacular sighting must surely have been during the dress rehearsals for the play Dear Octopus, when the cast were on the stage practicing their lines. The actors gradually became aware of a strange light slowly appearing in the centre of the dress circle. As they gazed, dumbfounded, the light gradually formed into a head and shoulders of what looked like a nun sitting, watching the cast. They stared obviously back at her, and after a while, their figure faded away. The actors then recovered and just continued rehearsing their play. However, a few moments later, the same thing happened again, but this time the ghost was less distinct, as if the form was gradually losing colour and shape. In 1965, some members of a production company attempted to rid the theatre of the spirit, formed a circle in the small room by the dress circle, where odd occurrences have been noted over the years. After a few minutes, the group gradually became aware of the sound of approaching footsteps, and suddenly everyone present shrieked as a tall woman in a long gown walked straight through the closed door and into the room. One of the actresses became hysterical, screaming with utter fright. Upon this, the apparition immediately vanished. Clearly the apparition was more scared of the woman than the woman was of the apparition. That's what it sounds like. Mrs. Susan C. Bullman relates the very strange experience of her brother Ian on a day trip to York. This was in July 1962. Susan was then a young girl and a few years older than Ian, who was about 6 at the time. I remembers that they were on an outing to the city with their parents. At around 4 p.m, the four had walked along the Roman wall, also visited the museum and gift shops, but found there was still about an hour before their train home was due, so they decided to visit York Minster. York Minster's beautiful. It's really beautiful. I've been myself. It's also got that atmosphere. You just can't explain it. You'd have to go to understand. Once inside, Ian began to lag behind his family, though Susan, as a protective older sister, kept a watchful eye over him. She can still recall her mother saying how she wouldn't like to be left alone in the minster at night because of the gloomy atmosphere. When Susan looked back at Ian, he seemed even further behind. Suddenly, he ran towards them and hid under his mother's coat, crying and obviously distressed by something. After he calmed down, Ian said that he had seen a man running about the minster very fast, wearing no clothes. Their father tried to make light of it, saying he would give his jacket to the man if he was naked, but there was nothing to account for Ian's strange behaviour, and they all left the minster feeling a little uneasy. In the following years, no one ever mentioned the incident unless Ian himself brought it up as a subject. As he grew older, Ian described the man in more detail. He said the man had long black bushy hair and was darting about wildly near the altar. As he watched, Ian had become very scared. He recalled he had stood near one of the iron gates, looking through to a part which had been cordoned off, and it was frightening because no one else had noticed the man. even though there were other visitors there, and some were looking in the man's direction, but not showing any reactions at all. His father always tried to reassure Ian, saying that it could have been a dream, he'd been falling asleep while awake, maybe just for a few minutes. And yet Susan had only turned away from her brother for about 10 seconds, so she pointed out that he must have fallen asleep standing up then. When Ian was about 10 years old, he started buying a children's magazine called Look and Learn. One day, Susan was glancing through it when she came across an article about a man named Jonathan Martin, a lunatic who'd set fire to York Minster. However, what made Susan really go cold was the fact that the man had been naked. She knew from the moment that Ian indeed he'd probably seen a ghost all those years ago. Recently, she asked Ian about his experience, and he was able to describe the incident very clearly. Although Susan says she has never seen a ghost herself, she clearly remembers looking into the face of her brother, who just had, and will never forget the expression of genuine pure fright. And now we head over to the old dairy at Kirkby Hall. In the old dairy at Kirkby Hall near York, there is often the smell of freshly baked bread when there's no one around to account for it. There's also the sound of children's feet running, and this has been heard on stone-flagged passageways of the ground floor, along with the rustle of silk. Mr. and Mrs. Clark, former resident caretakers at the hall, experienced a number of odd things during their time working there. However, the curious incident sounds as if it was something like a crisis apparition, a situation where someone undergoing a crisis, or often at the point of death, appears in quite another location in front of a friend or relative, rather than a ghost attached to the hall itself. It doesn't really go into detail into why they assumed it was a crisis apparition, though, which is interesting. Mrs. Clark had been instructed that a lady would be coming to visit the hall, and that she was to be made very welcome on her arrival. Mrs. Clark waited and waited, but there was no sign of a visitor, so she locked up and retired for the night. At 2 a.m, Mrs. Clark was awoken by the sound of a car's engine. It was obviously approaching the hall up the driveway. Peering out of the window, she saw a white-haired old lady get out of a car, a standard Vanguard, and close the door with a bang. Mrs. Clark opened the window to inform the visitor that the door was locked and say that she would come downstairs and let her in. However, on opening the window, she watched as the old lady climbed back into the car and drove off. The next day she received a phone call from the visitor's companion, who told her that the lady could not come to visit. She had been killed at 2 p.m. the previous afternoon in her car, a standard Vanguard. It was only then that Mrs. Clark realised that the car that had appeared the previous night could not have entered or left the hall grounds, as the gates on the drive had been firmly closed and locked. That's why I guess they call it the crisscross ghost. It sounds like that, doesn't it? Like it was more of a premonition or a sign, I guess. Like so many ghosts reported throughout the ages, the Roman soldiers seen in 1953 by apprentice plumber Harry Martindale in the cellars of the Treasurer's house in York seem to have been disturbed by renovation work to old stonework. The labyrinth cellars below the city streets have been the scene of several ghostly encounters with the centurions, but Harry's description of what he saw is of particular interest. The Romans appeared just a few feet from him, in procession, marching through one wall and then out of the other, and yet did not once turn to him or acknowledge his presence in any way. Their dusty, ragged, dishevelled appearance did not match the Romans as depicted in Hollywood movies of the time, which convinced researchers that the young man was telling the truth, not to mention that fact that Martindale noticed specific details about the Romans' attire which were not widely known at that time. 4 years after this now famous encounter, the then caretaker, Mrs. Joan Mawson, also reported sightings of Roman soldiers. On the first occasion, while walking through a low tunnel towards the cellars, she encountered a troop of Roman soldiers just 2 feet away from her. She subsequently saw them several times. Sometimes they were on foot and other times on horseback. Like the soldiers Harry Martindale reported, they looked dirty, dishevelled, mud-splashed and exhausted. One mounted soldier was resting his head on his horse's neck as it trotted through the cellar, in an attitude of extreme tiredness. Researcher Steve Cliff and 2 colleagues decided to investigate the haunting. Although they were not actually allowed to hold a vigil in the cellars at the time, as they were in a dangerous state, they were permitted to set up recording equipment, which was then retrieved by the group the following morning. Among the sounds recorded were that of a bugle, marching feet, and steady rhythmic beating of something like a kettle drum, and the sound of someone breathing very, very close to the microphone. Interesting. York was well known, though, for all its different battles and Roman soldiers and such. Let's continue. Miss Joanna Rudd, who lives a few miles outside York, replied to one of a newspaper appeals for spooky experiences, and if there were a prize for the most fascinating happening recorded in the volume, I'm sure it would be reserved for this particular one. Miss Rudd said, "I am writing to tell you of an incident which happened between York and Ripon on Sunday evening, early in March 2001, around 8 p.m. I was in my final year of teacher training at Ripon and York St. John's College in Ripon, and, as usual, I had travelled home for the weekend. I was returning to college along the route I took each weekend, but on this particular occasion, I was an hour later than usual when the following happened. It was a dry, clear night with no moon, and my journey had been uneventful so far. I turned off the A59 onto the slip road for the A168 just past Allerton Park. The A168 was formerly part of the A1 and now runs parallel to it for a few miles between Walshford to the south and Dishforth to the north. As I neared the end of the slip road, I looked onto the main road to see if it was safe to turn. To my left, I saw 2 sets of headlights side by side, as if ready for a race. At first, I thought nothing of it, as I knew there was a lay-by there and thought that one car was parked in the lay-by. I noticed that the car to the left of the pair had one headlight brighter than the other. I waited to see if they would pass, as I had no wish to be followed by cars in a race, but they appeared to be stationary. I pulled out and set off, right, towards Borough Bridge. I glanced back in the mirror and noted that the cars had gone. This did seem strange, as I had seen them both so clearly. I had a good view of the stretch of the road at all times, but I just thought they might have turned off their slip road, turned off the headlights. I continued up a slight incline, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a car with one headlight appeared close to the back of my car. It did not speed up from behind, as the road was clear. It just appeared, like someone had dropped it there. The car seemed quite old. It had like round headlights, one shining brighter than the other, giving the car an odd appearance. The light was so intense it lit up the inside of my car, and I could hardly bear to look in the mirror. A feeling of sadness and despair seemed to come over me that I had not previously been feeling, and I frantically tried to concentrate and listen to the radio. I started to panic, as I felt the car was moving even closer, and I was sure it wouldn't be long before it was going to crash into me. I did try to see a driver, but the headlight proved too bright to even make out the shape of a car or even try to look for a driver. I braked a few times in the hopes that the driver would overtake me, but this was to no avail. As I climbed to the top of the hill, a point where it was possible to see the road behind clearly, the car just disappeared. As quickly as the light had appeared, it just went out. The car did not leave the road, as I would have seen the beam of light move and probably seen the car as well. Furthermore, on that particular stretch of road, there's no junctions, gateways or lay-bys, and the grass banks quite sharp at either side. Throughout the whole experience, which lasted about 10 minutes, although it felt like hours, no other vehicle passed me in either direction. I've been back along that route many times. I failed to find any reasonable explanation as to why that car was following me so closely and appeared so quickly to disappear even more quickly. During 4 years of using the road regularly, nothing like this has ever happened to me before and has not done since. Phantom cars. There's lots of stories of phantom cars, actually. So that's the end of the, I guess haunted places of York. Although there is many more, but that's where we're going to leave it at, guys. And when we come back, we're heading to South Yorkshire. That's where I live, in South Yorkshire. So we shall see. Thank you for listening and many blessings.